everyone, this is Melanie from Late Beams Treasures, and today we are going to read another excerpt of How Come They Always Had Battles at National Parks. This is a hilarious history book. It's a factual and fun survey of American history from the beginning through the Civil War. It's by Peter Bales, PhD. I read the first 7 pages along with the introduction yesterday, and I think I'm going to enjoy reading this. It is going to take quite some time to read, but I figure I'll do it in 30-minute segments. So if you like this content, please give a thumbs up, subscribe, hit the notifications. This way you know each time that I will be reading another excerpt. And of course, check out my other events and contents that I do have on my channel. So now, how come they always had the battles in the national park? Here comes the British. Or, come on everybody, just speak English. In 1609, Henry Hudson, an Englishman in the employ of the Dutch, sailed into the harbor of New York and noticed a wide river running north. Hudson was the captain and he shouted, "Hey, there's the Hudson River." Nobody dared challenge him. The Dutch was also interested in the fur trade, so in 1621, the Dutch East India Company founded the colony of New Netherland. It is true the Indians sold Manhattan for about $24 worth of beads and other stupid stuff to Dutch settlers led by Peter Bales. The proliferation in recent years of tribal-owned gambling casinos is, in the light, truly poetic justice. In the 1600s, England and Holland became colonial and commercial rivals, and in 1664 an English naval force appeared in the harbor of New Amsterdam, present-day New York City, and ordered the Dutch governor Peter Stuyvesant to surrender. Stuyvesant went ballistic and cursed a lot, which must have sounded really funny in Dutch. But since he was low on munitions, he was forced to comply. The British took over and renamed the city New York. But the Dutch left behind lots of place names and cool customs, such as Easter eggs, Santa Claus, and games like bowling and golf, which unfortunately have always been overshadowed by their ridiculous wooden shoes. In the 1500s, England had no colonies of her own in the New World, so in an extreme expression of sour grapes, English sea captains frequently attacked Spanish treasure ships. Wanting to put the Protestant English in their place, Catholic Spain's King Philip II in 1588 sent out what he called his Invincible Armada into the English Channel in preparation for the invasion of the British Isles. Invincible proved to be a relative term, and in short order, 130 heavily armed ships were sunk and otherwise disabled by English sea dogs in their smaller but faster and more maneuverable ships. The Brits deliberately set some of their ships on fire and sent them crashing into the Armada, which is something that would have even impressed Indiana Jones. Spain went downhill for the next 300 years, and Great Britain rose to become the world's predominant and mostly pompous sea power. By the way, you can insult a Brit by calling him a limey. That's because English sailors used to suffer from scurvy, a deficiency in vitamin C, until some genius figured out that if you sucked on limes, it would take care of the problem. Adding a piece of lime, lemon, or pearl oyster to a cocktail came much later in history and has absolutely nothing to do with this. Great Britain would eventually get around to colonizing the Atlantic seaboard of North America, and in 1587 they took their first shot on the island of Roanoke off the coast of present-day North Carolina. 3 years later, a resupply ship found the place completely empty. Probably starvation killed off most of them, and the rest were either adopted by the Indians, or, if you're an optimist, or killed. The only clue left behind was the word Croatoan carved into a tree, undoubtedly by the craziest colonist muttering under his breath, "Ha! Let the bastards try to figure that one out." The first prominent North American settlement for England was Jamestown, Virginia, which was established in 1607. The survival of this colony is notable because of how completely clueless the early settlers really were. Many were gold-hungry gentlemen who flatly refused to perform the hard labor necessary for survival in the harsh wilderness. Locating their settlement in the midst of the mosquito infested swamp was another bonehead maneuver. Fortunately, John Smith took charge and declared, doubtless with a musket in hand, "He will not work, shall not eat." After John Smith returned to England the winter of 1609 to 1610, it became known as the Starving Time, and Jamestown became a truly charming place to live if you were a maggot. When the food gave out, the hapless colonists ate horses, rats, dogs, snakes, and lizards. One hungry man killed, salted, and devoured his wife, for which he was duly burned to death and eaten. Just kidding, it's probably safe to assume they buried the guy. Take note that there is no solid evidence that Pocahontas ever stepped forward and begged for John Smith's life. Let's face it, the entire Disney film Pocahontas is more fiction than fact. The talking tree is definitely a stretch. The citizens of Jamestown, as early as 1619, elected representatives to a colonial legislation called the House of Burgesses. The first meeting ended inauspiciously on a kind of sour note, an outbreak of malaria. But that was the first appearance of representative government in America. Ironically, today many would argue that a malarial outbreak in Congress would not necessarily be a bad thing. Meanwhile, back on other side of the Atlantic, the Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England and practices that reminded them of Roman Catholicism. Most English people looked up upon these Puritans the way we look upon those extremely early risers who ring our doorbells on Sundays and give us religious pamphlets. The Puritans were divided into different sects, groups themselves, one of which was the Pilgrims. Fed up with their treatment in England, the Pilgrims moved to Holland, where they still continued to catch an attitude from the neighbors. Finally, in September of 1620, they decided to sail to the New World on a ship called the Mayflower. They were supposedly headed for Virginia, but 65 days later, and wind, yeah right, had blown them off to the rocky coast of New England at Plymouth Harbor. In truth, the Pilgrims initially landed on Cape Cod, England, before they ventured around to more hospitable moorings. Perhaps they could sense the future traffic nightmares the summer months on the Cape would bring. Plymouth Rock, the place where legend states they stepped foot ashore, is probably a fabrication, but some guy who just wanted to sell t-shirts. Even before setting foot on land, the Pilgrims wrote the Mayflower Compact. It was the first written constitution in North America. The idea was to create a set of laws for the good of the colony as a whole. Today, you could call an 800 number and order the Mayflower Compact along with some lipstick and eyeliner. Now, that's progress for you. William Bradford, the Pilgrims' first governor, was elected every year for 30 consecutive years. Obviously, Bradford himself was the only one who counted the votes, but historians never seem to mention this. The first winter, only 44 out of 102 of the Pilgrims survived, but nobody gave up. The next year brought good harvest, lots of beaver and fish, and the famous first Thanksgiving. Friendly Indians came to the feast, and there were all kinds of good things to eat, including roasting wild turkeys. But there was no football, there was no drunken relatives falling asleep on the couch in front of a TV set. Squanto, a Pawtucket Indian, brought food to the hungry Pilgrims. He showed them the best places to hunt and fish and demonstrated how to plant strange crops like corn, beans, squash, and pumpkins. Conveniently, Squanto spoke English. It's like on Star Trek, when every time they go to another planet there are beings there speaking English. You just have to go with it. Most importantly, in the settlement of New England were the Puritans. Those religious zealots who believed everyone in Great Britain was having way too much fun. Those pious stick-in-the-mugs organized the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It came to America and proceeded to wear black, walk around with long faces all the time. The Puritans worked hard and prospered. The Protestant work ethic served them well, and Governor John Winthrop declared, "We shall be a city upon a hill," the holy city for all of humanity to emulate. These stirring words really inspired the Puritans so much that they all frowned and continued about their business. No one remarked on the time, but if the Puritans were such an upright, dour bunch, they didn't believe in enjoying themselves. How come they had such an incredibly high birth rate? A courageous woman by the name of Anne Hutchinson got kicked out of Massachusetts for arguing that people could go into heaven whether they had led a virtuous life or not. She's my hero. Roger Williams, a minister of the church in Salem, advanced the shocking idea that it was wrong to seize lands from the Indian without paying for it. He also denied the right of the Massachusetts government to interfere in religious matters. Despite their own experience with religious intolerance in England, the hypocritical Puritans expelled Williams, whereupon he and his followers founded the colony of Rhode Island. The Puritan clergy back in Boston referred to the Rhode Island as that sewer, a sink in which the Lord's debris had collected and rotted. Williams and his friends sneered back, "Whatever you say bounces off me and sticks to you like glue," or to those words in the effect. And they were even. American society grows more sophisticated, or would you please put your shirt on for dinner? The chief of the Wampango was Wampanango. I'm pronouncing that wrong. Wampanoag. That's it. The chief of the Wampanoag was called King Philip of the New Englanders because of his adoption of European dress and customs. In 1675, when he got fed up with English encroachment on Indian land, he initiated the bloodiest war, if you take population into account, in American history. The colonists thought King Philip violent and uncivilized, so to teach him a lesson, when he was captured, he was shot, beheaded, drawn and quartered, and he had his head displayed on the pole for several years. In fact, Native Americans introduced the European to corn, beans, tomatoes, and potatoes, and the European gave the Native Americans smallpox, yellow fever, and malaria. That pretty sums up their relationship. In 1692, the Puritan town of Salem played host to this hysterical witch hunt. 19 people were convicted of practicing witchcraft and hanged. One man was pressed to death under heavy stones. Even some dogs were executed, reportedly when they routed out by some of the local cats. Puritan passions run amok, mass hysteria, proof of what can go wrong when church and state merge into one. But wait, the New York Times in 1976 reported the scientific theory that witches of Salem had eaten bread contained with a fungus similar to LSD. There, you see? Everything was logical. Explanation, not. In New England colonies, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, freemen, who owned property and belonged to the local church, conducted their town affairs and enacted local ordinance in town meetings. This direct democracy, in which citizens show up and personally participate, as opposed to representative democracy, in which citizens elect legislators, provided the colonists with self-government and a real taste of freedom. Notably, most of New England towns set aside land for public schools. The town meeting generally worked well. The only downside occurred when some loudmouth had to be shouted down or, in extreme cases, tarred and feathered and chased through the town square. Wooden stocks served as an alternative punishment in which the malcontents had their arms, legs, and heads shackled for days in public. In colonial times, this type of bondage was considered a deterrent to antisocial behavior and not kinky fun on the weekends among consenting adults. Life in the southern colonies, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, came complete with hardships. The warm climates spawned malaria, dysentery, and typhoid, and lifespans were short. Men outnumbered women, and it was extremely difficult to find a mate, which is especially frustrated in the age before Playboy and Penthouse. Most people in the colonial South were dirt poor, without a pot to piss in. Literally. Toilets and plumbing of any kind were unknown. Chamber pots were a luxury. And most impoverished farm families had to do their business squatting in the woods while birds and chipmunks snickered at them. But for the few lucky in the southern colonies, fertile soil resulted in a plantation economy that raised tobacco, indigo, plants that yielded blue dye, and rice, plants that had really good well with mugugai pan. The plantation owners grew richer and richer and evolved into aristocracy that, while seeking to emulate a well born England, usually ended up looking like Beverly Hillbillies at a former dinner party. In 1676, a demographic Virginian named Nathaniel Bacon organized a group of about 400 malcontents who were frustrated over the inability to obtain farmland and women. They were poor and horny and a volatile combination. When Governor Sam Berkeley refused to retaliate for Indian attacks on some frontier settlements because he did not want to jeopardize the fur trade, which he had at stake, Bacon and his rabble took matters into their own hands. They attacked a bunch of peaceful Indians, hey, the warlike ones could be dangerous, and then marched to Jamestown and burned it to the ground. Bacon died of dysentery before English forces called in from New York could track him down, but about a dozen of his followers were hanged and the rest were chased into the woods. During the colonial period, there were actually about 300 episodes similar to Bacon's rebellion, which goes to prove that 1. The poor have always resented the rich in America, 2. Hollywood's portrayal of colonial times as total genteel and homespun is really a crock, and 3. Now it is always a good idea to lock the door at night. On the positive side, admission to colonial Williamsburg was free back then. The middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, lacked a distinctive institution such as slavery or the town meetings, so they've always gotten a lot less press than the South and New England. Also known as the bread colonies, family-sized farms produced a surplus of grain that was exported to the other colonies and to Europe. Many opportunities existed for artisans and merchants who tended to congregate for the growing large cities. By 1750, Philadelphia had passed Boston and was the most populous city in English America, although New York City, as always, that was known as the best place to party and the best place to meet colonial chicks. William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, in 1681 declared his colony a holy experiment, and most of the time greater religion tolerations prevailed in the region than anywhere else. One Swedish observer in 1744 noted that the multi-ethnic nature of the middle colonies reported numerous Scots, English, Dutch, Germans, French, Irish, and hold on to your hats, one Jew. Quakers were devout pacifists, and inspired by Penn, by 1775 there were about 40,000, mostly in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. When they were hassled about their belief, or the silly hats that they all wore, the Quakers proved more than willing to kick some serious colonial butt. Peacefully, of course. During much of the 1600s, many of the British poor contracted with southern planters to work the field hands for 4 to 7 years in exchange for the costs of the transatlantic passage. Others of the debtors sold or indentured themselves to artisans in the north. By the beginning of 1700s, the South's chronic need for labor caused planters to switch from the white indentured servants to more readily available black slaves. Slavery spread slowly throughout the colonies, but spread it did. In 1670, there were only a few thousand slaves, but by 1750, there were 400,000. Regulations sprang up to deny blacks their civil rights and forever put them in their place. Commonly, slaves were denied freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, and the right to earn money or even to learn to read. Black men could be killed or castrated for having sex with white women, even though the vast majority of interbreeding took place because white men used their power as masters to have sex with female slaves. This race lightening has been a constant component of American history. This has nothing to do with Michael Jackson's bleaching his face, but somehow that is completely weird. The British government promoted policies that modern economists have dubbed mercantilism, meaning that the British viewed their colonies as potential sources of raw material, and that could benefit the mother country and only the mother country. Towards the end of that passed a series of navigation acts that were supposed to keep the colonies trading with England. And not only did those dirtbags in France, Spain, and Holland. The colonists took these laws just about as seriously as we take 55-mile-per-hour speed limit, and they quickly adopted prosperous trade routes history teachers have always described as the triangular trade. In fact, these routes were more of a pentagram shape, and one sea captain with an inner ear infection was rumored to have his crew on a voyage that resembled an octagon. Anyway, one example would be a New England shipping rum to Africa in exchange for black slaves. The slaves were then sold in the West Indies for sugar and molasses, which in turn were carried back to New England and distilled into rum. The colonists loved triangular trade because they usually ended up with both profit and mixed drinks. Appointed by the king, colonial governors were usually content to lay low, collect their ample salaries, and live in nice mansions. The colonists happily governed themselves through elected assemblies. Even if they really didn't want to, Governor Edward Cornbury of New York had little chance of inserting royal authority after being spotted on the streets wearing a dress. Some have suggested that his purse did not match his shoes, a faux pas that created greater outrage. In the 1730s, attacks by John Peter Zenger's weekly journal infuriated New York City's Governor William Cosby, no relation to the famous comedian. Zenger was brought to the court on charges of seditious libel. The judges were biased from the start. They supported Cosby, but Zenger's attorney persuasively convinced the jury to acquit his client because the articles printed were true. The court decision laid the foundation for America's tradition of free press. Little did they know that the future certainly sleazy journalists would blatantly lie and then seek legal cover behind the freedom of press. But hey, at the time of Zenger and his friends, felt pretty good about themselves. In the 1740s, a wave of religious fervor swept through the colonies. Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield woke up in a sweat, preaching fire and brimstone and telling everyone that they were just sinners in the hands of an angry God. This great awakening ran its course for a few years, but it did cause divisions in the established churches and give people the idea that it's okay to challenge authority, and in this case, create their own churches. It's always called the first truly American national event, and it did foster religious tolerance in the colonies. But let's face it, a lot of people shreked, trembled, lost their lunch, and generally behaved like the audience on the Jerry Springer Show. The great achievements in the scientific revolution all took place far from America. Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, company and all were Europeans. But the colonies did produce one man who could hang out with these guys. One of the most remarkable people in the American colonial era, Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was a writer, a printer, a philosopher, a politician, a diplomat, and a scientist, all rolled in one. From 1732 to 1758, he edited the Poor Richard's Almanac, which was packed with all sorts of witty expressions, most of which make little or no sense today. What mountains one vice would bring up two children? Huh? But honesty is the best policy is always relevant. And fish and visitors stink in 3 days, for anyone who has ever had their in-laws visit. As a scientist, Franklin invented the Franklin stove and bifocals, and flying a kite by a thunderstorm, luckily not getting his colonial posterior toasted. He proved that lightning and electricity were the same substance. Crossing the Atlantic, he noted that ocean currents and temperatures correctly theorized about the existence of a Gulf Stream. Most of us on cruise ships just try to sleep it off on the deck in chairs. Due to his reputation with the ladies and rumors about illegitimate children, he was credited both with inventing the lightning rod and having a lightning rod. By the mid-1700s, the colonists had shed many of their European customs and traditions. Their new world, with its limits and sometimes dangerous frontier, demanded a different point of view. A new person evolved, individualistic, self-reliant, and fiercely proud, an American with an attitude. No one expected it or planned it, but the seeds of self-government were being sown as American placed more and more faith in the idea of free people making their own laws. Then suddenly the British government started to act as if the king exercised final authority in the colonies. Uh-oh, stay tuned, don't touch that dial. This really happened. When Daniel Boone turns 12 years old, his father gives him a brand new rifle and he spends days in the Pennsylvania woods learning how to shoot and trap. By the time he reaches Kentucky, the great frontiersman and Indian fighter was a way of turning a solitary stroll into a year-long adventure. After one such disappearance, he returns to Boonesboro and announces generally where he's been. Upriver to its source, south maybe 100 miles or so, west again, and through a fine valley with many deer and splendid stands of oak and pine, and then back again. But someone persists in asking, in all that time, did you ever get lost? In Kentucky, the legend of Daniel Boone answer still survives. Nope, weren't lost none. I was a mite confused there for a few months. And the rest is history. And that's a picture of Daniel Boone. Now, it turns out this actually has a quiz. So it's a multiple choice quiz. I'm just going to read it, so let's see if you can get the questions right. Europeans were able to dominate the New World because they possessed technology superior in A. Agricultural equipment, B. Weapons, C. Architecture, or D. Evening wear. The colonists in Virginia did not find gold or silver, but they did find they can make a lot of money growing A. Pot, B. Corn, C. Wheat, or D. Tobacco. Jamestown survived in part because of blank recognized the importance of building houses and raising food. Is it A. Mel Gibson, B. John Peter Zenger, C. John Smith, or D. Bob? Spain could not block English penetration of the New World after the defeat of its blank in the English Channel. After the defeat of A. Bullfighters, B. Armada, C. Synchronized swimmers, or D. Mariachi bands. The Dutch were the first to claim and settle the area which is now New York City. They called it A. New Amsterdam, B. New Netherland, C. The Big Apple, or D. Gotham City. The middle colonies produced surplus grain and soon became known as the A. Cracker colonies, B. Seafood colonies, C. Bread colonies, or D. The drunken colonies. The blank was a British review ship that ran around and was burned by angry Rhode Islanders. Was it the Minnow, the Nina, the Pinta, or the Gaspee? The movement to instill the movement to instill evangelical zeal in the colonies has been known as the A. Enlightenment, B. Renaissance, C. The Great Awakening, or D. The Sweeps period. British promoted mercantilism, the idea that A. Colonists were too stupid to run away from their own affairs, B. The colonies should exist before the benefit of the mother country, C. The colonies should do what's best for themselves, or D. Colonial goods should now be sold as buy one, get one free. And Benjamin Franklin was not only a statesman, but he was also an A. Dentist, B. Slave owner, C. Scientist, or D. Crossdresser. That was Chapter 1. So tomorrow we will talk about Chapter 2, which is Revolution and a New Government, or Trust Me, This Will Never Work. Once again, this book is How Come They Always Had the Battles in National Parks? By Peter Bales, PhD. If you like this, Tune in to tomorrow as I read Chapter 2. For now, thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day. This is Melanie with Lightbeam's Treasures.